early 1944, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. A test pilot steadied his hand on the throttle of the P-51B Mustang, pushing past the standard war emergency power setting. The engine roared with a ferocity that shook the cockpit as boost pressure climbed to 75 inches of mercury, fueled by a new experimental gasoline known simply as Grade 150. The airspeed indicator swept past numbers that defined the limits of Allied fighters to date. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang surged through 448 miles per hour. On the ground, test engineers exchanged knowing glances as the radio crackled with the pilot's report. This was no marginal gain. This was a revolution, hidden in purple-dyed aviation gasoline. A chemical edge so profound it would shatter every assumption the Luftwaffe held about American fighter capabilities. The war over Europe was about to change, not because of a new airframe or a brilliant tactical breakthrough, but because of a fuel that pushed existing fighters to performance levels German pilots couldn't have imagined. What the Luftwaffe did not yet understand was that American and British fuel chemists had achieved something the Third Reich's synthetic fuel program could never match. While German fighters struggled on B-4 fuel rated at 91 octane on the lean mixture scale, and their best C3 fuel barely equaled Allied 130 grade gasoline, American refineries were producing aviation fuel with a staggering performance number of 150. The implications were nothing short of staggering. A P-51 Mustang running on standard 130 grade fuel could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The very same aircraft, flown by the very same pilot at the same altitude on 150 grade fuel, could exceed 448 miles per hour. German fighter pilots who had long respected the Mustang's range and altitude performance were about to discover that the Americans had fundamentally rewritten the rules of aerial combat. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, the Luftwaffe's frontline fighter in early 1944, maxed out at about 400 miles per hour at altitude. The Focke-Wulf 190A could reach 408 miles per hour under optimal conditions. Against Mustangs running on 130 grade fuel, German pilots at least had a chance to pick their engagements. Against Mustangs fueled by Grade 150, they were at a critical disadvantage that no amount of skill or tactical cunning could surmount. The story of this advantage begins not on the battlefield, but in peacetime laboratories, where petroleum chemists understood that octane rating measured how much an air-fuel mixture could be compressed before it spontaneously detonated. Higher compression ratios meant more power from each combustion cycle, which translated to faster aircraft and higher operational ceilings. The science was straightforward, but producing high-octane aviation fuel on an industrial scale was an extraordinary engineering challenge. In 1940, while Europe was already engulfed in war, American aviation fuel production centered on 87-octane gasoline, enough for commercial planes and early military trainers, but inadequate for high-performance fighters. The British, desperate for any edge against the Luftwaffe's numerical superiority, collaborated with American oil companies to develop 100-octane fuel, available just in time for the Battle of Britain. The results were immediate and dramatic. British Spitfires and Hurricanes using 100-octane fuel gained 30 to 40 miles per hour more speed at altitude, and climb rates improved by 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. German pilots accustomed to their 91 to 100-octane fuels suddenly found themselves on equal footing. The leap to 130 grade fuel brought further transformation. This fuel, rated at 130 on rich mixture settings, became the backbone of Allied air power throughout 1943. It powered the Merlin engines of Spitfires and Mustangs, the Allison engines of P-38 Lightnings, and the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radials and P-47 Thunderbolts. Production scaled rapidly under the leadership of aviation fuel advocate General James Doolittle, who had championed high-octane fuel development throughout the 1930s. By 1943, 17 Allied refineries were producing high-octane aviation gasoline using the catalytic cracking process perfected by French immigrant engineer Eugene Houdry. American refineries alone churned out millions of gallons a month, enough to fuel the massive bomber offensive over Germany and the protective fighter screens. In contrast, German fuel production remained bottlenecked by reliance on synthetic fuel derived from coal. The Burgess process converting coal to aviation gasoline was technically sound, but slow and resource-intensive. Even at peak output, Germany could produce only a fraction of the high-octane fuel flowing from American refineries. Most German fighters flew on B4 fuel rated approximately 91 octane lean, while their premium C3 fuel, used primarily in BMW 801-powered Focke-Wulfs and select Messerschmitt variants, was roughly equivalent to Allied 130-grade fuel but scarce in quantity. By 1944, about two-thirds of German aviation fuel production was C3 grade, still a small fraction compared to Allied output. Understanding fuel performance requires grasping a fundamental engine principle. Octane ratings measure detonation resistance. As a piston compresses the air-fuel mixture, temperature and pressure spike. If the fuel ignites prematurely, before the spark plug fires, detonation occurs, a destructive explosion that damages engine parts. Higher octane means greater resistance to detonation at higher compression. By definition, octane ratings cannot exceed 100 since 100 octane equals pure isoctane, the reference standard. Performance numbers, however, indicate how much better a fuel performs beyond isoctane. A performance number of 150 means the fuel can withstand 50% more compression before detonating. Creating such a fuel required adding anti-knock compounds, primarily tetraethyl lead, and carefully blending aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene with the base gasoline. British chemists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment tested countless blends through 1942 and 1943, seeking the optimal balance of anti-knock properties, energy content, and manufacturability. American researchers at Wright Field conducted parallel studies, sharing data with their British counterparts. By early 1943, both nations had produced experimental batches designated as 150-grade fuel. The name was somewhat misleading. It implied a 150-octane rating chemically impossible. Instead, it indicated a fuel with a performance number of 150 on rich mixtures and 100 octane on lean mixtures. Dyed purple for easy identification, this fuel underwent extensive testing throughout 1943, with results exceeding all expectations. Merlin engines running on 150-grade fuel sustained manifold pressures of 75 inches of mercury, compared to 67 inches on 130-grade fuel, directly translating to increased horsepower. The Packard Merlin V1657 powering the P-51D generated 490 horsepower at standard military power on 130-grade fuel. The same engine running on 150-grade at war emergency power in the P-51B V1653 variant pushed output to about 1,600 horsepower. Flight tests at Wright Field confirmed substantial performance gains across all flight regimes. Maximum speed increased by 25 to 30 miles per hour at altitude. Climb rates improved by several hundred feet per minute. And crucially, these benefits required no airframe modifications. The same Mustang, flown on 130-grade fuel one day and 150-grade fuel the next, became measurably faster and more capable simply because of what flowed through its fuel lines. The decision to introduce 150-grade fuel operationally came in early 1944, timed carefully. The 8th Air Force, based in England and conducting daylight raids deep into Germany, was suffering unsustainable bomber losses. Despite the arrival of P-51s in late 1943, German fighters still inflicted heavy casualties. What planners needed was not just long-range escort, but fighters so fast German interceptors couldn't easily disengage or refuse combat. In May 1944, the first operational deliveries of 150-grade fuel reached England. Distribution was tightly controlled. Not every squadron received it immediately. The 8th Air Force prioritized select units to manage supply and evaluate combat performance. The British Royal Air Force, which pioneered much of the testing, also began equipping squadrons with the new fuel, prioritizing those tasked with high-speed interception, especially missions hunting the V-1 flying bombs, terrorizing London by June 1944. V-1 flew at roughly 400 miles per hour at low altitude, a speed that challenged existing interceptors. Hawker Tempests and Spitfire 14s barely caught them. Mustangs running standard fuel were marginal. Mustangs running 150-grade fuel had enough speed margin to reliably intercept. On June 18, 1944, Major R.E. Turner of the 356th Fighter Squadron destroyed a V-1 by tipping its wing with his P-51's wingtip, a daring maneuver requiring exceptional speed and precision, steering the bomb off course and sending it crashing. This technique was used at least 16 times during the campaign. The first widespread combat use of 150-grade fuel by American P-51 pilots came in June 1944. Coinciding with the Normandy invasion, fighter groups of the 8th Air Force flew combat air patrols and bomber escorts fueled by the new gasoline. German fighter pilots began reporting encounters with Mustangs performing beyond prior experience. Luftwaffe intelligence collected these pilot reports describing American fighters that seemed impossible to catch, accelerating effortlessly away, showing power reserves that defied explanation. Initially, German officers dismissed these as pilot error, fatigue, or exaggeration. Their pilots were tired, outnumbered, and facing mounting losses. Superior American fighter performance was rationalized away. This was a grave mistake. Gerl, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories primarily on the Eastern Front, flew combat missions against American fighters over Germany in 1944. In interviews decades later, he recalled his shock at the performance of late-war Mustangs, impressed by their speed, climb rate, and altitude capability. Gerl and others didn't realize they faced aircraft chemically enhanced beyond original design limits, operating at power settings Mustang engineers never envisioned. The Merlin engine, designed by Rolls-Royce and built under license by Packard, had tight thermal limits and detonation margins. Running at higher boost pushed these limits to the edge. Grade 150 fuel allowed engines to withstand these extreme conditions without destructive detonation. The chemistry was complex. Fuel molecules, air, heat, and pressure interacted inside combustion chambers. Tetraethyllead, the main anti-knock additive, disrupted spontaneous ignition's chemical chain reactions. But trade-offs existed. Tetraethyllead was toxic, requiring careful handling by ground crews. It caused spark plug fouling and valve deposits, increasing maintenance needs. Fighter units using 150 grade fuel saw more frequent spark plug replacements, cylinder inspections, and adjusted overhaul schedules. The performance gains justified the increased maintenance burden. Pilots had to learn new procedures. Manifold pressure limits rose. Overboosting, especially at low altitude where air density was greatest, risked engine damage. Fuel consumption soared at maximum power, so pilots had to manage throttle carefully, balancing bursts of speed with fuel conservation. Escort missions to Berlin already stretched Mustang range. Using 150 grade to full effect demanded skillful fuel management. Combat reports from summer and fall 1944 show the transformation. 8th Air Force groups equipped with 150 grade fuel reported higher victory-to-loss ratios and improved intercept success against German fighters attacking bomber formations. German fighters that once made hit-and-run attacks now found Mustangs closing fast with no escape. On August 6, 1944, Lieutenant Hollis Bud Allen of the 357th Fighter Group, flying the P-51D Hellsbells on Operation Frantic missions to Soviet bases, engaged a Messerschmitt Bf-109 flown by Ga Shak. Nolan's speed advantage proved decisive. He closed rapidly, firing a burst that damaged Shak's cooling system. Low on fuel and ammo, Nolan broke away, waving to the German pilot before returning to escort duty. Shak belly landed near German lines. For decades, Shak wondered why Nolan hadn't finished him off. Unaware, the American thought he'd merely damaged the plane. When later reunited by historians, Shak acknowledged the Mustang's unprecedented performance, the speed and power reserves unmatched in previous air combat. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots was profound. Outnumbered and outgunned, they now faced Mustangs with what seemed like limitless performance. Tactical choices shrank. Mass attacks hoping to overwhelm escorts, refusal to engage preserving pilots, or combat risking near certain death. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring reportedly remarked upon seeing Mustangs over Berlin that the war was lost. Luftwaffe technical intelligence eventually obtained Allied 150 grade fuel samples from captured tanks and crashed aircraft. German chemists confirmed what pilots reported. The Americans had developed a fuel with unmatched performance characteristics. Late-war German C3 fuel sometimes approached 150 grades performance, but was limited and inconsistent. Allied bombing of German synthetic fuel plants in May and June 1944 further choked production. By late 1944, Luftwaffe fuel rationing was severe. Fighter units got priority, but even they operated under strict limits. Pilot training was cut drastically, and many new German pilots entered combat with minimal hours, unlike their well-trained American counterparts. Between January and May 1944, before widespread 150 grade use, American bomber loss rates ranged from 3 to 6% per mission, sustainable but costly. Between June and December 1944, after 150 grade fuel introduction, loss rates dropped below 2%. Fighter kills surged. Across the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces, American P-51 groups claimed approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat from late 1943 to May 1945, many after June 1944. The German pilot force, once experienced despite heavy Eastern Front losses, was systematically decimated. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, only 2 Luftwaffe fighters appeared over Normandy beaches. Though thousands of aircraft remained, fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and tactical inflexibility rendered them ineffective. The technical specs of 150-grade fuel bear repeating, lean mixture octane rating of 100 resisted detonation like pure ice octane at cruise. Rich mixture performance number of 150 withstood 50% more compression at maximum power. This allowed pilots to cruise efficiently, then push engines hard in combat without detonation risk. Handling 150-grade fuel demanded special care. Ground crews wore protective equipment due to high tetraethyl lead content. Spills were immediately cleaned to prevent poisoning. Fuel trucks and tanks were clearly marked to avoid mixing grades. Despite hazards, accidents were rare. Pilot training updated manifold pressure limits and operational guidelines. No aircraft modifications were needed. Engines and fuel systems were compatible with both grades, simplifying logistics. The production story is one of unmatched industrial might. Between May 1944 and April 1945, the 8th Air Force consumed over 53 million gallons of 150-grade fuel. Allied refineries likely produced over 200 million gallons during operational use. Each gallon demanded refining infrastructure, toxic chemical additives, rigorous quality control, transport to Europe, secure storage, and distribution to dozens of airfields. American industrial capacity in 1944 was astonishing. Factories built bombers by the thousands, fighters by the tens of thousands. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than Germany could sink them. Oil refineries produced aviation gasoline exceeding all German fuel production combined. Years of development, vast natural resources, a protected homeland, and millions of women workers fueled this effort. The Royal Air Force extensively used 150-grade fuel in Europe. British squadrons flying Spitfire 14-fours, Tempest Vers and Mustang 3s and IVs got priority allocation. RAF pilots reported performance gains mirroring American experience. Tempests, already among the fastest piston fighters, became even more deadly. Between June and September 1944, RAF 150 Wing Tempest shot down 638 V-1 flying bombs. No. 3 Squadron alone claimed 305. Squadron leader Joseph Barry downed 59. Belgian ace Remy van Liarde 44. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont 31. The Mosquito followed with 623 kills, Spitfire 14303 and Mustang 232. The performance margin proved decisive in every role. Combat effectiveness of 150-grade fuel was proven repeatedly through late 1944 and early 1945. Fighter groups reported increased kills and fewer losses. By March 1945, nearly every P-51 unit ran the fuel. Combat reports show one-sided results. German fighters rarely challenged Allied formations effectively. When they did, losses were heavy. By April 1945, missions over Germany often found no opposition. The Luftwaffe was finished, destroyed by attrition, fuel shortages, and the systematic loss of experienced pilots. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The air war ended with absolute Allied air supremacy. This supremacy had many causes: the Mustang's long range, excellent pilot training, and overwhelming numbers. But the petroleum engineering advantage of 150-grade fuel was a crucial factor. The purple gasoline turned good fighters into exceptional machines, gave pilots confidence, and embodied the combined technological and industrial might of nations that could outproduce, out-innovate, and outlast their enemies. Speed matters in aerial combat. A faster fighter chooses when to engage or escape. It has tactical flexibility slower opponents lack. When American fighters became faster through superior airframes and fuel, Luftwaffe options narrowed sharply. By late 1944 and early 1945, the contrast was stark. Allied fighters flew multiple combat missions daily, limited only by pilot fatigue and maintenance. German fighters often sat grounded for lack of fuel. When airborne, strict fuel conservation limited combat capability. A German pilot burning too much fuel risked not returning. Allied pilots could push full power, confident in fuel reserves. This operational flexibility had strategic impact. Allied fighters maintained constant patrols, responded aggressively, and sustained operations. German pilots flew knowing every sortie might be their last, not due to enemy fire but fuel scarcity. Allied pilots, by contrast, flew with confidence born of material superiority. Fast aircraft, abundant fuel, robust support fostered aggressive tactics, better results, and higher survival. The story of 150-grade fuel is a story of industrial warfare. Victory belonged to those who produced not just more aircraft, but better ones. Not just adequate fuel, but superior fuel. Not just trained pilots, but an overwhelming surplus backed by an industrial base that replaced losses faster than inflicted. American and British fuel chemists never flew combat missions. They never faced flak or enemy fighters. But their work, measured in octane numbers and manifold pressures, helped decide who controlled Europe's skies in 1944 and 1945. Every time a P-51 pilot pushed forward the throttle and felt his Mustang surge with power German fighters couldn't match, he was benefiting from chemical engineering that transformed crude oil into victory. German planners expected American fighters to perform within known limits. Instead, they faced aircraft whose performance exceeded calculations, fueled by production infrastructure Germany could not counter. By spring 1945, as Allied armies overran Germany, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a coherent force. A few units flew, often with barely enough fuel for one sortie. Jet fighters like the Me-262 arrived too late, in too few numbers, hampered by fuel shortages and pilot scarcity. The final tally shows the cumulative effect of Allied advantages. American P-51 groups flew hundreds of thousands of sorties, claiming approximately 4,150 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and another 4,131 on the ground. These were not just planes lost, but pilots killed, experience gone, and German industry wasted replacing fighters destroyed before impact. Grade fuel was not solely responsible, but was a vital margin of superiority, turning close fights into decisive victories. The 448 miles per hour a properly boosted P-51 could reach represented more than speed. It was technological might and industrial power. This was the unexpected weapon German planners never anticipated. Fuel chemists and petroleum engineers far from the front lines creating a weapon as lethal as any gun or bomb. Purple gasoline that influenced aerial combat as surely as tactics or training. The key to air supremacy lay in piston engine compression ratios, anti-knock properties of hydrocarbons, and fuel performance numbers beyond German reach. The P-51 Mustangs flying over Berlin in early 1944 were remarkable. The same Mustangs flying there in 1945 were powered by fuel that made them faster, stronger, and more deadly. That difference, measured in octane, manifold pressure, and airspeed, helped decide who would win the skies of Europe. In that decision lay the fate of Nazi Germany and the proof of Allied industrial might, expressed as a purple liquid pumped into tanks, burned in powerful engines, and transformed into victory one mission at a time.